So I'm going to give a kind of fairly general introduction, and some of you, like these people sitting here in the front, will have heard some of it before, so sorry about that. But and obviously some of you are much more knowledgeable than others, so I hope you bear with me if some of it you already know. I'm trying to cover a sort of general audience. Okay, so two of the main questions I wanted to answer when I began researching Vaughan Williams's 1905 trip to King's Lynn, which gradually developed into my book, was how did Vaughan Williams become interested in collecting folk song, and how was it that he ended up in King's Lynn? So before we hear in detail about the songs he collected in the various counties of East Anglia, which we're going to hear the rest of the day, I thought it might be useful to explore his earlier life. To help us understand the context for the folk song collecting he began in earnest in December 1903 in Ingrave, Essex, when he collected the song Bushes and Briars and recognised, quote, something new yet absolutely familiar. After this event, he wrote down over 800 songs in his notebooks before the outbreak of World War I, a collection of melodies which were to have a profound effect on his composition. Next slide, please. So to find the origins of his interest in folk song, we need to go back to his childhood. In the two main sources of autobiographical notes on his musical life, Vaughan Williams identified the Cherry Tree Carol as his first introduction to folk song at the age of about 10. He remembered that his reaction was, quote, more than simple admiration for a fine tune. Though at the time he didn't understand the sense of intimacy which he always felt when he encountered a work of art. As he described it, here's something I've known all my life. So every Christmas his family would visit an aunt who was, quote, much bitten by the William Morris movement. She frescoed sunflowers on her walls and put bottled glass in her windows. And one of the byproducts of this movement, this is what Vaughan Williams said, was the cult of the Christmas carol. He described his aunt as a first-rate musician, and her children were musical too, and they would gather around the pianoforte in the evening to sing carols from Stainer and Bramley, a book of carols. And the tune of the Cherry Tree Carol, one of several traditional airs used in the book, remained, quote, a fragrant possession all his life. And now we're going to attempt to play this little tune, if the technology allows. So that's just the tune that started him on his journey. Next slide, please. Oh, let's have it again. Why not? Such brilliant piano playing. Okay. So Vaughan Williams doesn't name the aunt, but a story retold in the biography by his second wife, Ursula, about dressing up for a Christmas party, identifies the family as the Massingbirds. And the aunt, who was actually a cousin by marriage to Vaughan Williams's mother, was Emily Massingbird, who we can see in this very striking portrait here in 1878. So perhaps, you know, when Vaughan Williams was about 6. So that's what she would have been looking like when they were singing these carols. At that time, the Massingbirds were living in the Red House in Bournemouth, an arts and crafts influenced house that Emily had commissioned. And it still stands in Bournemouth, that's it, taken a couple of years ago. It's a Bournemouth suburb, still has its bottled glass and a large double-height room, especially designed for meetings, theatre and musical performance. The stated aim of the Stainer and Bramley book, Christmas Carols New and Old, was to, quote, obtain traditional carol tunes and words which have escaped the researches of previous collectors. It contained 14 tunes listed as traditional. Published first in the 1860s, the publications concerned to preserve old tunes fitted into a growing movement to conserve the countryside and rural culture that was seen to be under threat from industrialisation, which culminated in the establishment of numerous conservation organisations, such as these ones listed here. Vaughan Williams's childhood experience at his aunt's was part of the progressive, nonconformist intellectual milieu in which he grew up. Emily Massingbird, part of the progressive circle, was no ordinary aunt. She was, in fact, an active campaigner for the advancement of women's interests. That's what she described it as, including women's suffrage and temperance. She founded the Pioneer Club in London to provide a meeting ground for women workers of all kinds. And the members were identified by numbers rather than names in an attempt to remove class discrimination. The club's motto was, "They say, what say they? Let them say." This sort of motto of defiant independence was over the entrance to the club, but was also, next slide please, painted in large writing on a wall of the room in the Bournemouth house where the Stainer and Bramley carols were sung by the young cousins. As well as directly introducing Vaughan Williams to traditional melodies, Massingbird may have modelled for him a defiance in the face of discouragement from his Darwin-Wedgwood relations, who declared he was a foolish young man who would go on working at music when he was so hopelessly bad at it. The Massingbird family supported his musical ambitions, and it was Emily's son Stephen who passed on the message of independent thinking when he told Vaughan Williams that Parry declared that a composer must write music as his musical conscience demands, an idea which stayed with him as a principle throughout his career. Given this cultural context, it was not by chance that Emily Massingbird introduced the Stainer and Bramley Book of Carols to her children and their cousins. And as a result, the sound of traditional music was embedded in Vaughan Williams's consciousness and sparked a small flame in his imagination. After experiencing the power of this early influence, it was a rational response for him to later champion, along with Cecil Sharp, the idea of introducing folk song into the school curriculum. Next slide, please. Another significant influencer throughout Vaughan Williams's childhood was his neighbour, Lucy Broadwood. From the age of 2.5, Vaughan Williams grew up at Leith Hill Place in the Surrey Hills near Dorking, and living only 4 or 5 miles away were their neighbours and family friends, the Broadwoods, a branch of the family famous for manufacturing pianos. And social interaction between the families was regular. Lucy Broadwood was 14 years older than Ralph and knew him from birth. In later life, she wrote in a letter to Cecil Sharp of her literally lifelong regard for RVW, and described how Ralph was born with a quite unusually sensitive, impetuous temperament, which in childhood naturally was remarkably apparent. She was at the centre of the campaign to preserve folk songs as a member of the committee that founded the Folk Song Society in 1898, and as the long-serving editor of the Folk Song Society Journal. She was also a knowledgeable and accomplished musician. Next slide, thanks. Broadwood had a huge influence on Vaughan Williams as he was growing up and as a young man. In April 1923, he wrote a grateful letter to her, which said, "If I only just say thank you, it means that I can't say all I should like to. But I remember years ago at St. George's Square, when I was very raw, how you showed me Purcell and Bach and many things I did not know. And as to folk song, it was you who first introduced me to it." So here we have, in his own words, the composer's acknowledgement that Broadwood was instrumental in the development of his interest in folk song. St. George's Square was the location of the Broadwoods' London house, and it's likely that Vaughan Williams was referring in the letter to the time when he was first a student at the Royal College of Music in 1890. In his autobiographical notes, he describes himself as painfully illiterate at that time. He means musically illiterate, obviously. But I think she first introduced him to folk song a lot earlier than that period. So Broadwood was actually in a position to introduce him to folk song at any point in his childhood. Broadwood herself had grown up with folk song. She was the niece of the Reverend John Broadwood, who's credited as one of the first collectors to write down both the words and melody of folk songs from the mouths of singers after hearing them in his parish in the 1840s. And she grew up with knowledge of the songs and became actively engaged when she and her cousin, H.B. Reynardson, decided to publish her uncle's collection with accompaniments, together with some songs she had collected herself locally. And it was published under the title Sussex Songs. Next slide, thanks. The period of collating and collecting, running up to the publication of Sussex Songs in 1890, coincides exactly with the years when it's recorded that Vaughan Williams showed an active interest in folk music. His second wife, Ursula, who wrote his biography, which I mentioned before, confirms in the book that he was familiar with Sussex songs, and at school he wrote his first folk-influenced piece of music in 1888, based on Welsh traditional songs. And J. Ellis Cook, the son of the gardener at Leith Hill Place, recalled that during these same Charterhouse years, which was 1887 to 1890, the teenage Vaughan Williams would ask workmen on the estate to sing to him, and he would write notes down, ask for the same song again, and write down any difference, which is evidence that he was already aware of the concept and practice of collecting. Collection of folk songs from traditional singers was still a scarce activity in the late 1880s. So this, combined with the close connections Vaughan Williams had with one of the few people who was actively involved in it, Lucy Broadwood, makes it highly probable that it was at this point that Broadwood first introduced him to folk song, or he became actively engaged in it anyway. And this is a photo of the Leith Hill Place staff in 1885. It's very likely that the young Vaughan Williams collected songs from some of these people. Mark Cook, the gardener, with the hat on there in the front row, was evidently loved by the family. Adeline, Vaughan Williams' first wife, took photos of Cook and his grandchildren in the late 1890s, and it was his son who remembered Rafe collecting in the school holidays. When, as an adult, Vaughan Williams returned to song collecting in late 1903, he went back to Leith Hill Place and visited John Longhurst, a relation, maybe distant, but certainly a relation of Anne, who's labelled there, Anne Longhurst. She was the maid at Leith Hill Place, and also Phyllis, who was the wife of Edmund Berry, who I think is the groom here. Other people think it was his son, but I think the dates mean that it's Edmund, in case anyone here wants to talk to me after. And he was the groom, and he's sitting on the far right of the picture. Next slide, thank you. Vaughan Williams started his formal musical training at the Royal College of Music in London when he was 18 in 1890, although he continued to live at Leith Hill Place from where he commuted to London. But 2 years later, he started a history degree at Cambridge. But the subject of history was chosen to fit in with his music timetable, and he continued weekly lessons at the Royal College and took composition and organ lessons in Cambridge. And after finishing his history degree, he continued studies towards a music doctorate at the RCM and began paid work as an organist for a church in Lambeth. In 1893, he experienced the first of 3 moments of epiphany related to particular folk songs. These were Davison, I never know, is it Divis? Dives, okay. I get told different things all the time. I'll say Dives here, good. Dives and Lazarus, Bushes and Briars, and The Captain's Apprentice. These last 2 will be discussed by other speakers today, so I'm just going to talk briefly about the impact of Lazarus on his journey towards committed folk song collecting. In one of his autobiographical reminiscences, he writes that his real awakening to folk song occurred when English county songs came into my hands and I lighted on the Lazarus tune as it is given there, which is this copy here. This book, published in 1893, was co-edited by Lucy Broadwood and J.A. Fuller-Maitland. Vaughan Williams wrote that as soon as he heard Lazarus, he realised that, quote, this was what we had all been waiting for, something which we knew already, something which had always been with us if we had only known it. The melody could be found all over the country, sent to many different sets of lyrics. You probably all know it, but I think to a general audience, the best known version is probably the Star of the County Down. So, diddly dee diddly diddly dee dee, yeah. Okay, next time. I think it's worth looking at the influence of this song in a little bit more detail as an example of the way Vaughan Williams wove folk melodies into his work. Once he started collecting, he came across several versions of the Lazarus tune. In the Journal of the Folk Song Society in 1905, he published 4 variants of the tune associated with the words of Maria Martin, which I expect lots of you will know is a song about a real murder in Suffolk. And he collected these during 1904 and early 1905. And this slide shows his notes for the journal entries. And he collected another variant of the tune, not here, from Mr. Smith of Britford near Salisbury in September 1904, set to the lyrics of Erin's Lovely Home. So it's clear that this tune pops up everywhere. By December 1904, Vaughan Williams was working on the commission to edit a new English hymnal and was looking for melodies to fit the words of religious texts. The airs he was collecting went straight into the publication. Over 30 traditional melodies were used in the first edition, including this one. Next slide, please. For the Lazarus tune, he chose I Heard the Voice of Jesus Say, and renamed the melody Kingsfold after the village where he collected a version of the tune near Leith Hill Place. This practice of using a well-known folk melody to accompany devotional words caused some controversy within the Anglican Church when the English hymnal was published. As Vaughan Williams wrote in a letter to Simona Pakenham in 1958, he never made public the titles of folk songs he used for hymn tunes because, quote, a lot of narrow-minded people refuse to use the tune if they think it has sexular, i.e. secular, associations. The Lazarus tune is a good example. Lucy Broadwood traced the melody back to the ballad Gilderoy, who was a real Scottish man who was hanged in 1638, apparently. And the earliest version of the tune she found was published in 1719. And she lists numerous examples of other songs set to variants of the melody. Both Broadwood and Vaughan Williams noted that the melody was commonly associated with both the words of a carol, another devotional song, a carol, Come All You Faithful Christians, and the words of the murder ballad Maria Martin. Next slide, please. A version of the carol was collected from Mrs. Wheeler, a charwoman from Weebly, Herefordshire in 1904, and it was published in the 1905 journal along with the Maria Martin versions. And Vaughan Williams wrote that, quote, there seems to be some subtle connection between the words of Maria Martin and Come All Ye Worthy Christians, as they are so often sung to variants of the same tune. So if you look at the first verses of the songs here, you can kind of see why, because they both start with this kind of call to action and a warning against violence. So you can, come all you faithful Christians, alongside come all you thoughtless young men. You can sort of hear why that occurred to people to use the same tune. And there's also the warning, don't pass your time in rioting, and, think of my unhappy fate to be hanged upon a tree. You can sort of see that there are parallels and why people might have associated those two questions, although which came first, I don't know. Maybe somebody in the room might do. I don't know. Come and tell me afterwards. Vaughan Williams published the carol under the title Come All You Worthy Christian Men, accompanied by the Lazarus melody in the Oxford Book of Carols in 1928. And the melody this time was renamed as Job. The melody remained an inspiration to the composer throughout his life and features as a theme in Fantasia on Suffolk Folk Tunes, Festival Te Deum, in the film score for The Dim Little Island, and as well as one of his most popular works, 5 variants of Dives and Lazarus. So I hope this brief interview of Lazarus has given you a flavour of some of the ways Vaughan Williams sort of incorporated the material he collected on his trips, and how certain folk melodies that were particularly significant to him had an impact on his musical output. Next slide, please. So, to return to Vaughan Williams's journey towards collecting folk songs, in 1895, 2 years after publication of English county songs and that first epiphany of hearing Lazarus, he was back at the RCM, exasperating his tutors, his word, by, quote, going berserk on the flat seventh and the sharp sixth and the Mixolydian cadence. He was referring to his interest in the modal scales, so often used in folk songs, which, as you will all know, use different patterns of intervals between notes to those found in the conventional classical scales of major and minor. So I've just shown them here as scales played on the white notes of a keyboard. It's his use of these modal scales which gives some of his music what we would recognise as its pastoral character. And at this point, it's worth remembering he was still 8 years away from collecting a folk song in the field. So he was already bitten by the sound of folk song. Next one. He continued to explore the potential of folk music to inspire his composition. He'd written to his friend and cousin, second removed, Ralph Wedgwood, as early as 1898, that it was a good idea for a composer to, quote, get the spirit of his national tunes into his work if it comes natural to him. And also, I very much believe in the folk tune theory, by which I don't mean that modern composing is done by sandwiching an occasional national tune, not your own invention, between lumps of tuppence a pound stuff. And here he's thinking about how composers might use the characteristics of folk music, such as modal and pentatonic scales, multiple changes in time signature and particular rhythmic patterns, to inspire what we might call folk-like themes. And he continued to believe that English folk music should be used by composers to inspire a new national school of English music. In his musical autobiography piece written in 1950, so, you know, when he was in his 70s, he wrote that if a composer can, by tapping the sources hidden in folk song, make beautiful music, he will be disloyal to his art if he does not make full use of such an avenue of beauty. Not yet. In this context, it's interesting to note that his first published work was Lyndon Lee. Oh, Lyndon Lee. Written around 1901 and published in 1902. With its subtitle, A Dorset Folk Song, which is, you know, a bit of a misnomer. It's a setting of a 19th century poem written in the Dorset dialect, one of a trio of poems by William Barnes, which Vaughan Williams set to folk-like music, including Blackmore by the Stour, also published in 1902, which one enthusiastic contemporary critic described as the cleverest imitation of a genuine folk song. So Vaughan Williams was already using folk song as inspiration for folk-like themes before he began his collecting career. And once he started collecting, he sometimes used direct quotes of folk song melodies, as we all know, as themes in his work, such as in Norfolk Rhapsody No. 1, the English folk song suite, and 5 variants of Davison and Lazarus. But it's also possible to trace the less overt influences of folk music permeating his composition throughout his life. In his remarkable survey of folk song quotations in Vaughan Williams's work, Adam Harvey has identified phrases from over 120 songs in around 30 separate works. So these are like little snippets, like samples sort of dropped into the music. His wife Ursula agreed that folk music brought a new vocabulary to her husband's work. It was a process in which phrases from the melodies he had collected became, quote, part of the texture of his own invention. Next one. In the same year that Lyndon Lee and Blackmore by the Stour were published, 1902, Vaughan Williams began to deliver a series of lectures on folk music. He later admitted that at this point in his career, he was fond of the folk songs he'd learnt from books, but was not fully convinced of their value. He said, quote, I only believed in them vaguely, just as the layman believes in the facts of astronomy. My faith was not yet active. He turned to Lucy Broadwood for advice and material for the lectures, and she sang illustrative songs at one of them delivered at Bournemouth. In these lectures, he argued that composers who used folk music as inspiration should not be accused of stealing, as, quote, these great popular tunes were the property of all those who by nationality, friendship, or analogous feeling found themselves in sympathy with them. And once he began collecting folk songs, he maintained this strong belief that collectors were giving back folk songs to the people by writing them down before they were lost forever, and by publishing and publicising them to a wider audience. Hence his strong support of copyright income going to the collectors rather than to individual singers, which has attracted criticism in some subsequent years. It's worth remembering that at this time Vaughan Williams's main concern was with preserving the melodies of the songs rather than the lyrics. Often he would only write down the words of the first verse and then refer the reader to various published collections for the rest of the words. As with all folk songs, the lyrics could usually be found in printed form, either on broadsheets or songsters or in books. And as many of you know, broadsides were sheets of paper printed with news and gossip and lyrics, like this one. Oh, the voice is going. Often written about the latest scandal, which was sold cheaply in the streets. It was rare to find the melodies written down to accompany these lyrics. Sometimes there might be a note at the bottom of a broadside that would print the title of another well-known song to indicate a suitable melody, sing to the tune of. This assumed a general knowledge of traditional melodies passed on from one person to another through the oral tradition, what we might call learning by heart. And it's this ephemeral aspect of the melodies which made the Edwardian collectors so anxious to write them down before the old people with the melodies in their heads died. And it's this lack of printed evidence which makes tracing the history of melodies so difficult, but it was also what made collecting so exciting. So every singer had a different take on the melody they sang, or even sometimes invented their own. So Vaughan Williams was concerned with preserving these melodies for their own sakes as cultural artefacts, but his primary motivation was to find good tunes that would provide the material for this new English school of music. And as he wrote, the work of the collector called for both scientific discovery and artistic presentation. He agreed that every traditional tune ought to be carefully stored for posterity, but only those which had beauty and vitality should be made more widely available. So, quote, for the student, a folk tune may be worth preserving for its historical or archaeological interest. For the singer and dancer, there is only one test. Is it beautiful? Obviously, what might be considered beautiful is subjective. So Vaughan Williams was particularly drawn to modal melodies. Julian Onderdonk's research has shown that only 40% of the songs that Vaughan Williams noted down were modal, but they made up 67% of the material he chose to publish as worthy of note. The three folk tunes which influenced him most, which I've mentioned before, Bushes and Briars, Dives and Lazarus, and The Captain's Apprentice, are all Aeolian. And I'd be interesting to look at the East Anglian collection to see what the proportion is in those as well. Next slide, please. In a lecture he gave in 1912, Vaughan Williams spoke about his collection of Bushes and Briars in 1903, which we'll hear more about soon, as his, quote, discovery of the first, or almost the first, folk song which I ever heard under its native conditions. When he says almost, he was possibly alluding to those earlier teenage collections on his family estate, which I've already described, but he may also be thinking of another episode which Martin describes in his book, Martin Grabe, As I Walked Out, which, if you read his book, you'll find out. But it appears that Vaughan Williams had collected some songs off a middle-class contributor earlier on. But this earlier meeting wasn't the kind of transformational event Vaughan Williams experienced a year later in Ingrave, Essex, which prompted him to later describe himself as being a psychical researcher who has actually seen a ghost, for I have been among the more primitive people of England. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to leave you here with Vaughan Williams in early 1903 at a point where, having delivered his folk song lectures in Bournemouth, he is about to take them to the small town of Braintree in Essex, not knowing that the visit will change his life forever. Thanks.